All right, well, I think we'll make a start if that's okay. I know Ray was sending people over, but I'm assuming they're here now. I'm assuming it was you. I was expecting about 4 people, so I'm happy. I'll go with this.
Take it as a result.
I am. Yeah, I've already won. It's great. Yeah, I can relax now. Yeah. Don't worry. I would just say I'm happy with more than 4 people being here, so I was just, it's great. All right, so my name's Paul Kirtley. I've been doing the campcraft and the fire lighting stuff up at the parachute camp today. I see some of you here from that, so I haven't put you off too much. Hi guys. So Ray originally told me that I had about 30 minutes. And he subsequently told me there's nothing after me before dinner, so I'll try and rattle through it, but maybe I'll pace myself a little bit more. So I'll try and take about 40 minutes of your time, so we finish a little bit before dinner, so we can get to the bar and have a drink before dinner starts. Okay, so one thing to say, you can get my slides. Yeah, so if you want to make notes, you don't need to. If you go to that address, you'll be able to stick your email address in, and I will send you a slide share of all these slides. So you can just focus on what I'm talking about now. And there's a few of the freebies I'll send you as well. I'll talk about those as we go. Because one of the things I wanted to do was touch on a number of different areas, and I could kind of go down the rabbit hole in each one. And if you want to go down that rabbit hole, then I'll send you the resources where you can do that. So if you go there, you just need to stick your email in, and I'll send the stuff. All right, so yes, I am a bushcraft instructor. I've been teaching bushcraft professionally for over a decade. I've been involved in teaching bushcraft courses since 2003, when I started assisting Ray Mears on courses after having done a range of training with him. I started my own company, Frontier Bushcraft, in 2010. So we have been going 9 years now. I've been doing that longer than I've been doing anything else in terms of teaching bushcraft. I worked full-time with Mears for about 5 years, which is when I originally met Ray Goodwin, when Ray was still working. And a lot of what I teach is all of the sort of stuff that we've been doing today. You know, campcraft, axe skills, knife skills, a lot of the stuff that's very useful when you're canoe tripping, particularly in wilderness places. A lot of what I teach is surrounded or centered on useful trees and plants and understanding nature and what we can do with them. And that might just be something as simple as this is easy to set fire to. And other areas are a little bit more nuanced than that. They're a little bit more subtle than that. And I've also been interested in foraging and wild foods for a long time. I'm a member of the Association of Foragers. I was one of the early members of that association. And it doesn't provide any accreditation, but it's a group of people who sort of share similar values, and I very much enjoy that side of things. I work with Ray Goodwin about 6 weeks of the year. We run a number of different programs, some aimed at beginners, others not so much, in the UK and overseas. That's us working together on the Missinaibi. We also work on the Spey. We do a couple of trips there every year. Now this photo, I want you to try and work out what Ray is doing here, and I'll let you in. This is an advanced technique in the world of paddling. Yeah.
Setting up a trying around sail.
Yeah. But he's not even in the water.
Yeah, but it's showing people.
So look at the concentration on his face. Yeah, it's like a Uri Geller-like concentration now. What he's actually doing is moving the canoe there with his mind and dragging himself across the grass with the empty canoe. Yeah, and look at how intently everyone's looking. Yeah, he's a real master. He doesn't even need to be on the water. Yeah, yeah. And you can tell him I said that later on. Oh, here he is. Oh. Now, don't take any notice of what I just said there about Ray. Okay.
Are you just giving me grief, or have you started, Paul?
I have started, but I am giving you grief.
If I just interrupt briefly, dinner will actually be at 7 o'clock, not 6:35. Right? So there will be more time for Paul and more time in the bar beforehand. Paul, thank you very much indeed. It's not true unless he says nice things.
I was saying this is an advanced technique, Ray. What you're actually doing there is you've attached an empty boat to the boat that you're in, and you're moving the empty boat with the power of your mind and dragging yourself across the land.
How here we can.
Exactly.
But we don't normally talk about. I thought I was going to be in trouble for talking about that when you came in.
Thank you very much, Paul. Would you like the lights out?
Yes, please.
Yellow lights.
Yes, he is showing people how to set up a tow. But the expression on his face amused me when I was looking through my photos. I do like to smash down rapids on days out. I am a paddler. I am in the British canoeing kind of world. I am a canoe leader and I am a canoe coach under the new coaching system. But it's not the majority of what I do. I am a leisure paddler. I like paddling as well. But I really like making multi-day journeys. I guess that's where my passion for canoeing really is, and getting into wild environments and exploring them and immersing myself in them. And I love the water. I love the paddling. I love that side of things. I love the techniques of moving through an environment, not just the paddling, but also the lining, tracking, poling, sailing. I love all of that stuff and putting them together to get through an environment, and of course portaging as well. Recently did a solo trip on the Berens River, which is a couple of rivers north of the Blood Vein River in Manitoba mainly, there just on the east of Winnipeg, Lake Winnipeg. Started there, Little Grand Rapids. Let's see if my pointy thing works. There, little Grand Rapids there, and then that's the Berens that runs out there. That's the Pigeon, if you've heard of the Pigeon, and then below that in there is the Blood Vein, so it's that part of the world. And I did that in August on my own, float plane in, and some good fun. And I'll have a video out about that at some point. But those of you that are familiar with Hap Wilson's guide to the North Manitoba wilderness rivers, I tried to recreate one of his photos as much as possible in that image. It was a really quite a stunning spot to camp there. Big moose. Really enjoyed that. So I am a committed paddler, just in case you had no idea who I was or why I'm at the Canoe Symposium. But for me, at the heart of the study of bushcraft is nature, understanding of nature, and around that you build knowledge, you build skill, and you build experience. And when I go into those wild places, and for me, paddling is very much a way to get into wild places, and I enjoy it in that respect. I also am interested in the other things that are going on, not just the water, and it was some of that I wanted to bring to you in this presentation, because there's plenty of people who are much more experienced than me, both in paddling and coaching here, that can share the paddling skills with you. But what I wanted to bring was a little bit more of a unique insight from my perspective, as largely being a bushcraft and to a certain extent survival skills instructor and a forager, that can overlay that on those wild places, whether they're close to home or whether they're further afield. So first off, it's not necessarily about the obvious. If you turned up in a campsite in Ontario and it had a big bear poo in it, you probably know that that's not necessarily a good place to camp, particularly if it's quite fresh. What's more interesting, though, is to look at what's in the bear poo. Like, it's full of chokecherry pits. Yeah? And so it's like if you're portaging through thickets of chokecherries, and you know that the bears are scoffing lots of chokecherries at the moment, then maybe that's where you might be more expecting to see them than other places. So I'm really interested in looking at the little signs of nature as much as anything. Also, wild foods. But I think most people here, if you've seen a blaeberry or a bilberry, could probably recognise that as some form of blueberry, something in the vaccinium. You wouldn't be surprised for me to tell you that that is a North American blueberry species. What I want to do is share a few things that are a little bit more, maybe a bit more useful to you, maybe a little bit more around the peripheries of what you might already know, We'll start off with the hazardous stuff because that's what always interests people. If you read the news, the newspapers, people are always interested in what's going to do you harm. Yeah, you only need to read the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or any of these things, and it's full of photos like this. Phototoxicity. Now, I do want this to be relevant to paddlers. I do want this to be relevant to people who are undertaking canoe journeys. And there are a number of plants that you find growing right next to waterways, both here in the UK and further afield, which will do you harm. And it's not about stuffing them in your mouth because they look like a blueberry. It's literally if you come into contact with them. And there's a couple of plants that you may well be familiar with that have a phototoxicity. So basically, and this isn't a chemistry lesson, don't worry, I've locked the doors, but there is a set of chemicals called Furanocoumarins which you find in certain plants, and what they do is they make your skin extremely sensitive to ultraviolet light. And so the chemical itself doesn't really irritate your skin, but the action of ultraviolet on your skin gives you sunburn that you wouldn't otherwise get. And that's the sort of reaction that you get. That isn't anybody that I know. That's a picture that I pulled from the internet. But that was actually from parsnips in somebody's garden, from the leaves. They've been pulling at parsnips. So it's the carrot family in particular that have these chemicals. Parsnips is one. But more of a problem to us as paddlers is this one, Heracleum mantegazzianum, which is a fancy name for giant hogweed. And it's one that's on the increase. Hands up who's seen this by waterways in the UK? Yep, lots of us. Okay, so I won't teach you to suck eggs in terms of knowing about it, but there does seem to be more and more of it around. It's from Central Asia originally. It was introduced by plant collectors. I think it was Victorians. They saw it as an ornamental. It is an impressive plant, but of course it has these really quite vicious chemicals in there. It's got really strong concentrations of these Furanocoumarins which cause problems. And you know, in terms of scale, if you're not familiar with this plant, it's like a triffid when it's fully grown. It's a big plant. That's on the spey. Some skeletal leftovers of plants from earlier in the year there. You see it right up and down the country, and it does like damp ground. Purple blotching, not to be confused with hemlock, which also has got a lot of purple spotting. There's plenty of literature and documentation about hemlock as well. There are members of that family that have got purple on them that are not poisonous, though. That it isn't just the purple that shows you, but that is one thing. It's quite a hairy plant. A lot of people don't recognize it when it's that size, though. Yep. So there, and there are all leaves of giant hogweed. That's in the spring, and that's down in the southeast of England when it's just first coming up. It looks like normal hogweed, like regular common hogweed, but it tends to be quite light in comparison. It's not that dark bluey green, and the leaves tend not to be so hairy. But that's possibly a time when we're going to be starting to go out paddling. The sun's going to be starting to be quite strong, and it's something that you could be coming into contact with, particularly if you're wandering around on the riverbank at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, and you've just got, you know, Crocs on or, you know, what have you. So it's one to be keeping an eye off. And I do have a video on that, which I will send you the link for. So that's one to worry about. Another one that is less well known is Oenanthe crocata, which is hemlock water dropwort, which people immediately, because of the name of it, get confused with poison hemlock. This is a different plant. This is not poison hemlock. This is not the classic Greek poison that you might know about. This is a different plant. This is actually quite common in the UK, and I've seen it around Europe quite a lot. And this loves to be in damp ground. It grows right on the edges of water. I've seen it on the banks of the Conwy, for example, here locally. And again, when it's fully grown, it's about the size of cow parsley that you get by the sides of the roads in the spring. But the umbel, the flower head, is more open. You can see that the flowers, the clumps of them are all quite distinct. There isn't like a continuous flat top. That's because these rays are all about the same length, so they kind of spread out a bit more. In terms of identifying it, early in the spring, this is Cumbria, late March, early April. on the edge of a stream. You can see how much it likes to be in the water. The stem of it looks a bit like celery at the bottom there. There is no purple blotching on this. So those of you that have got it in your head that poisonous members of the carrot family have got purple blotching on them, well, hemlock does and giant hogweed does, but this is equally as poisonous as hemlock. This is one of the most poisonous plants in the UK. There are many documented cases of people poisoning themselves with this, thinking that they've got wild parsnips, for example. You can see that familial resemblance. The stem looks a bit like celery, which is also in the carrot family. The leaves look a bit like celery in this instance. And when it starts to grow, again, in water, it starts to look a bit more like flat leaf parsley, which is also in the carrot family, or maybe coriander, which is also in the carrot family. So it has that familiar resemblance. That's a little footbridge across a ditch. Again, it's growing in the water. You find this in the places where you're going to go paddling. It will grow in damp ground. It has little carrot-like, parsnip-like roots, which are highly poisonous. They're most poisonous in the spring. But you're not really going to come a cropper with that unless you're going to do some random, ignorant foraging, although some people do. That's from the British Medical Journal, I think, that one. And that's a case of a guy on the Thames who decided that he would forage some roots and some leaves and make himself really poorly with hemlock water dropwort. And again, I'll send you a link to that if you want it. That's what it looks like. As I say, it looks like somewhere between flat leaf parsley and coriander. And you will see it on the banks of rivers now that I pointed it out to you if you don't know it already. It's really quite a pretty plant, but as I say, you've got those distinctive individual clusters. So that's one to look out for as well. It has the Furanocoumarins in it. So you're probably not going to poison yourself by eating it, but you will potentially get a contact dermatitis from it if you get the sap on your skin and then you've got sunshine on your skin. It does the same sort of thing as giant hogweed, but not as many people know about it. All right, this one, another chemical, yeah, which urushiol comes from urushi, which was a Japanese word, but basically we're talking about Toxicodendron radicans, which again is a great scientific name, more commonly known as poison ivy. So this isn't one that's going to bother us here, but for those of you that paddle in North America, this is one of your main concerns in terms of contact poisons in many of the places where you might paddle. 3 leaves at the top of a stem. That was on a little portage trail near the French River in Ontario. So if you're on the French River or Killarney, places like that, you're going to come across poison ivy. And it seems to be more common in the more commonly paddled places. That's the type of thing it does to you. I think there is some lotion on top of that as well, but there's blistering, there is inflammation, lots of swelling on one leg compared to the other, and it's quite long lasting. I think this was 3 days in from what I read, but it tends to irritate and come back for quite a long time. So get to know that plant. 3 little leaves at the top. It almost looks a bit waxy around the edges. It isn't really toothed, but you really don't want to be coming into contact with it. Again, you know, your feet, going to the toilet, lying down, in camp, any of those sorts of things, you do not want to be in contact with it. That is according to one of the botanical databases in the States where you find it. I can tell you categorically that I've seen it in Manitoba, even though it isn't on this map. It definitely occurs in Manitoba. And I'll prove it to you because that's a photograph I took on the blood vein, which starts in Ontario but very quickly goes into Manitoba. I only saw a few clumps of it on one particular day, but it was definitely there. And as you can see, it starts to go, as many autumnal leaves do, starts to go reddy brown. And it's a really pretty colour sometimes. That's in amongst some juniper there that you can see there. So you might be interested in picking the juniper berries, but you wouldn't want to be touching the poison ivy. So it's one to be aware of for sure. Plants don't just harm, though, they can heal. You know, I don't want to frighten you about ever going near any plants or a river or anything ever again. There are some that can harm you, and I've pointed out some of the major ones we need to be concerned about if we're near waterways on this side of the Atlantic or on the other side of the Atlantic. But this was a situation on a trip where I'd had one of those pratfall capsizes where the water isn't even hardly deep enough to fall in, and somehow you go in on just like, we went in on a little rock step. And in going out of this boat from the outfitter, I somehow took a chunk out of my thumb. I think it was on the top of one of the screws on the gunnel where I kept hold of my paddle, and it proceeded to kind of keep cracking because it was right on the crease. And this is quite a few days in where it got really quite sore, and I was feeling like it was starting to get a little bit infected because it's in the water, it's hard to keep clean, it keeps cracking even though it's crusting over. And I was like, okay, I need to do something about this. So rather than go for my first aid kit, I did have some betadine in there that I could have put on it. I thought, okay, I'm going to try and use some balsam fir. Yeah, so went and found some balsam fir. It is renowned as an antiseptic. And on the balsam fir, you have these little blisters, a little bit like you sometimes get on younger firs like Douglas firs, for example. But this one in particular, they're quite pronounced often. And if you pop them, it's quite liquid in there. It isn't sort of crystalline. It's really quite liquid, like the center of a sort of locket, but even more. And in fact, you can use it for sore throats as well. It's very effective on sore throats. And smeared it on, and I don't have a photo of how it looked a few days later, but I do still have my thumb, so I didn't have to have it amputated. It worked really well. It not only helped the swelling and the infection which seemed to be forming there, but it also helped it sort of not be so dry that it cracked all the time as well. So it had a double effect, and it really helped with the inflammation, it really helped with the infection. So that was a case of me using my knowledge of the trees to actually help with a problem that I had on the trip. Not a major problem, but again, I've got an article on that if you're interested in it. It's on my blog. And also, because people ask me, what can we use over here? There are a number of alternatives that we can use on this side of the Atlantic that are also have similar antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties. So they're in those articles on my blog, which I will also send to you if you ask for the slides. Here's another plant that many people might recognize. Anybody know what that is?
Yarrow.
Yarrow, yes, well done. Yeah, it looks similar to some of those carrots that we looked at. The nasties that we're looking at, but this is actually in a completely different family. This is in the Asteraceae family, and it is a renowned medicinal herb, and it's one that you find in many places. This is in the Lake District. The Latin name for this is Achillea millefolium. So Achilles was supposedly renowned for having his troops carry this in their first aid kit. So that's where the Achillea bit comes from. The millefolium comes from thousands of leaves. So it has all these tiny little frilly, lacy leaflets, effectively creating this lacy effect. And it is a styptic. It will stop bleeding quite effectively, and if you dry it like the dried herbs that you get from the supermarket, so like oregano or any of those, and keep it in a bag, you can actually, if you've got a cut, you can actually put it on there, and it works a little bit like some of those modern quick clot type products. It will help seal over and form a scab and help stop the bleeding, and it also has some antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties as well. So that's a good one to know. So see it a lot around in the UK, but that's it on the Canadian Shield. It is widespread in places where you will paddle. And you don't have to just dry it, you can just mush it up and pop it into wounds, and it will help stop the bleeding. So again, that's a useful one for you to know just on your travels. And it's exactly the same plant. All right, there's Mr. Ray Goodwin again, being lazing there on the beach on one of his beach holidays. This is a lunch stop on one of our courses in the Lake District, and if you sort of cast your eyes away from the canoes and start looking at some of the plants, one of the plants you'll see there is meadowsweet, and a lot of people don't realise that the meadow bit actually comes from mead. It used to be used in the production of mead, and for us that could be interesting, but in terms of a direct practical use in the field, this is also a medicinal herb. It was the first plant that a natural form of aspirin was isolated from. And this is called Filipendula ulmaria, is the Latin name. The old name for it though, the old genus it was in was Spirea. Yeah, so A spirea in. The spirea bit in aspirin comes from the old Latin name for this plant. So it was a chemist working at Bayer, I think, if I remember correctly, who first isolated it. And so it does have salicylates in there, and you can make a simple tea of the leaves, and it does have some similar properties to an aspirin, but without some of those harsh effects that aspirin has on the stomach. So it's, again, you can make it if you've got a headache, if you've got pain, particularly joint pain, it's a good one to know about. And it grows near water. This is why I'm telling you about these plants. Yeah. So that's another good one. Here's one that you might be less familiar with. This is Labrador Tea, which you might have read about in tales of sort of northern paddling in Canada. This was quite a traditional thing to make, although it's now known that if you make it in some of the traditional ways, which was to boil it for hours and hours and hours or leave it on the stove for days, it actually pulls out too many toxins from the plant, and it's not good for you. Best practice now is, if you want to use this, is just to boil it for maybe about 5 or 10 minutes and then leave it at that, strain it off and drink it. And it has some beneficial properties, but this plant is in the rhododendron family, and many of you will recognize rhododendrons as poisonous, and many of them are. This is Rhododendron greenlandicum is the Latin name for it. It's quite a small plant. It's got rusty fur on the underside of the leaves, but again, this is one you're going to find a lot. You get it a little bit in Scandinavia, but it's mainly one that you get in Greenland and in North America. And again, it's one you may well find right next to where you're camped on a paddling trip. And it's an interesting flavour. It is high in vitamin C. That's the typical type of where you'll see it growing. It's just kind of a fairly small understory plant in amongst the spruce there and other things growing, lots of moss, just in between some open rocky areas that we're camped on, again, on a blood vein trip. But again, if you're intrigued by this plant, that's what it is. I've used it. It's quite pleasant if it's not too strong. And again, I've written quite an extensive article on that if you're interested in that. Again, it's in some ways part and parcel with some of the history of peoples of the areas that you might be paddling in where it grows. It's interesting to know about it. Another one that's a little bit closer to home, again, you can see it's growing in water. It likes to grow in damp ground. Yeah, it's here growing along the shore of a lake in the Lake District. So you've got it growing here. Yeah, and it's a form of mint. This is water mint. And as with many members of the mint family, which is the Lamiaceae, which also includes things like basil and rosemary, for example, and sage, they have leaves in opposite pairs, and each opposite pair is arranged alternately. So you get an opposite pair there, the next ones are that way, and the next ones are that way. They also have a square stem. Not every plant that has opposite pairs of leaves arranged alternately with a square stem is in the mint family. Clear counterexample would be the nettle. Stinging nettles have leaves in opposite pairs. They've got square stems. It's not in the mint family, but many of the mint family do. Then the mint genus, they're the ones that smell and taste of mint. And so it's pretty easy to tell whether they're a mint because they smell of mint. There's nothing that smells of mint when you crush it that's going to poison you. That, aha, I'm not a mint. No, it is there. So if you're walking around on the riverbank and you go, I can smell mint, it will be mint, and you can pick some and you can make a mint tea, which is pleasant enough in and of itself if you like mint, but also if you've got an upset stomach. That it's not an old wives' tale that mint calms the stomach. So sometimes people like to, after a heavy meal, they have a peppermint tea. It does actually help your stomach. And I had a case once where I had food poisoning from some chicken that wasn't cooked properly that somebody fed me the day before I started teaching in the woods for 2 weeks. And the only thing that really got me through that, running to the latrine about 4 times an hour, was drinking mint tea. Because it really helped calm my stomach down. It does work. So another good one to know about. Okay, so familiar scene, Scotland in June. It really is, I'm not joking. It's a bit wet sometimes. Yep. And that damp, boggy ground harbours an interesting plant, bog myrtle. Bog myrtle. And it tends to grow in areas like this. Looking up close, it's got a fairly simple, elongated, sort of ovate leaf a little bit of toothing on it. It's got these really pretty buds which are quite distinctive, and when you crush it, it has a smell that's quite herby. It's a bit rosemary-like, but not quite. Bouquet garni-ish, a little bit bay-like. It's not any of those things, but it's in that kind of slightly aromatic arena, and it's a pleasant smell. And this is the same plant. This is growing on a creek which is a tributary of the French River, the Memisaga Messing, which I paddled up one day, and there was loads of bog myrtle just up on the banks there. And people will know that I'm not lying, because those that know the flora of Ontario can see that there's some cardinal flowers there which are very pretty. But yeah, it's exactly the same plant. This is the site of, well, just behind where this photograph was taken was the site of the Hudson's Bay Company trading post on Brunswick Lake, which is off the Missinaibi River. And again, amongst other things, you've got bog myrtle growing in that area. So just a couple of distribution maps. That's the distribution of bog myrtle in North America. And they call it sweet gale as a common name, is the typical name they call it there. That's the distribution in northwestern Europe. Many of those places are the places that you might be going paddling. You will find this plant. Why are we interested? Well, it's actually quite a good natural insect repellent. You rub it on your skin and you not only smell nice, which is, you know, sometimes an advantage after a few days on a canoe trip, but also it actually does help keep the midges and mozzies off. And in fact, I think there was a commercial insect repellent produced in Scotland at one point that was made from bog myrtle. So that's another good one to know. And as I say, you'll find it here and you'll find it on the other side of the Atlantic. And it likes to grow near water. Different view of the world, looking down on the pole. Where's the UK? Where's the UK? Well, there's the Aleutians. Where is it? There it is. Oh, we're all upside down. So this is the distribution of a very, very useful plant. And I won't go into all of the uses here, but a view from a canoe. Again, it likes to grow on the edges of water and in ponds, and it's this one here with the cigar-like seed heads, long strap-like leaves, and it is what the Americans often call bulrush, although it's not a true bulrush. This is what we tend to call cattail or greater reed mace. The Latin name is Tifa latifolia, and it occurs right around the northern hemisphere. That photo was actually taken in Ontario, and this is the you've got the male and female parts of the plants here together. There's no separation between them. They give off a lot of, this part gives off a lot of yellow pollen at certain times of the year, which is edible. You can add that to flour and add it to your bannock, and you can only really get the benefit of eating pollen if you cook it, because the pollen grains otherwise just go straight through your system and come out the other end. You need to cook them to burst them so that you get the nutritional benefit, but you can augment your rations with that at certain times of the year just with the pollen. Another useful one, those of you that have been doing firelighting with me today, talking about dropping sparks into fluffy sort of seed heads that accept sparks. Cattail seed heads are very good for that. And they're available often right the way through the year, you know, when other plants aren't available. And actually, interestingly, some native peoples in North America used to use this like we use down to stuff clothing for insulation. It has that sort of warm, fluffy like quality to it. But if you tease it out even more and drop a spark into it, it will be useful in your firelighting. So what I've got there is a hearth board of dry sticks, then some cattail fluff, if you like, and then some dried bracken. And while the dried bracken won't catch with a spark, the Tifa will. The Tifa seed heads catch with a spark, but they burn very quickly, a little bit like cotton wool. It just burns through quickly. But if you've got something to catch the flames, bracken works well, other things work well, and then you can put your small sticks on and you've got a fire. So again, another useful one that you're going to find right by the river. Probably not so useful to you, but maybe useful in a survival situation, and it's one of the reasons why this plant is so, it's at the top of many lists of survival plants, is because if you take the ropey rhizome, which is like an underground shoot that links the plants, in the middle of that there is a bundle of fibres that are a little bit like the stringy bits in celery. And they're surrounded by starch crystals, it tastes a little bit like somewhere between a baked potato and the sweet chestnut when it's roasted, and it's pretty nice. I wouldn't tend to eat it raw because it's been in stagnant water normally, and in pongy mud it tends to kind of pong a bit. But you take the rhizomes out, as long as they're nice and white like that, not all brown. You've got this foamy material on the outside, and then you've got the fibres on the inside. And what you do is you can just chuck them straight on the embers of a fire on the coals and roast them until they go black and shriveled all around. And then what you do is you break them open. There's an obliging student of mine on one of my intermediate courses, and you basically just suck all the cooked starch off the stringy fibres, and you get an instant hit of sort of carbohydrate, and it's complex carbohydrate as well. There are more complex methods of processing this by pounding it and separating out the starch, and you can make flour and all sorts of things. But just as an instant complex carbohydrate meal, which otherwise is quite difficult to get from nature, particularly in the more northern latitudes, it's right up there at the top of your list. So that's a view in the UK of a pond, one side with cattails in it. That's a view in northern Ontario, exactly the same plant in similar conditions, right on the edge of a waterway, but in a more boggy area. You will come across this plant in your paddling adventures at some point if you haven't already, and it is one of the top survival plants. I teach a lot of uses. Native peoples used to use, or still do in some cases, the leaves for matting. You know, there's photos in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto of native ladies making mats by weaving these together. You can use them for covering ground ovens. You can use them for making doors on shelters. You can just use them for putting, you know, if you're roasting food over the fire and you've got nowhere else to put it, you know, you spatchcocked a chicken or a fish or something, it's just a food prep surface that's quite easy to produce quite quickly. You can get food right up and down the plant, stems, pollen, rhizomes. It's one of the best survival plants out there, and again, I've written stuff about that if you're interested in going down that rabbit hole a little bit more. Nice view, again, back on the blood vein, and this area is where the river goes a little bit more slack, and that evening was beautiful, nice for photography. Next day was a bit more grey, but what we've got on the edge of the river here is wild rice, and wild rice was traditionally collected in canoes because it doesn't all ripen at the same time. So what you'd need to do is paddle into an area of wild rice and knock the seed heads over your empty boat, and the ones that are ready to go will fall off, and you'll collect them in the bottom of your boat, and then you'll go back another time and do the same again. I witnessed the modern way of doing it, which is basically, you know, those the boats with the big fans on the back. Airboat, yeah. And on the front, they've got like this combine harvester type arrangement, and they just drive through quite fast through the areas of wild rice, and it just knocks all the ripe seeds into the collection tub on the front of this boat. So it's a bit quicker than a traditional, but you still pay quite a lot for wild rice, bags of wild rice, even though they collect it quite efficiently now compared to the traditional way. But anyway, that's what's there. That's what the rice seed heads like, and when they're ripe they go black like that, and you can see the starch in there, and actually they're quite tasty just to chew on even raw. And of course that is something that you could collect on canoe trips. You could knock a bit into your boat, collect a few handfuls, add them into your rations, and I've done that on trips, and it's actually really nice, and if you buy it in the shops it's quite expensive. There's Mr. Goodwin looking happy. So if you want to know more about that particular trip, again, there's plenty of stuff on my website, even Ray posing in his bug shirt. That's all there. You can, as I say, get the slides, and I'll send you all of those different things if you want to go down those different rabbit holes. You get to a little page like that, just click on that, stick your name in. So that's pretty much the end. I did say I'd finish around about 15:15, and I have done, so I rattled through that quite quickly. As I say, I could sort of go down each of those areas in a lot more detail, and I have in articles and videos and things. So please do, if you want to learn more about those different areas, just get the slides and I'll send you all the links as well. One last thing. Many of you know about my podcast, but many people don't know about my podcast. And yeah, I have got quite a range of guests on there. But in terms of this audience, just wanted to highlight, if you haven't listened to these, there are lots of paddlers in there. Ray Goodwin, of course, boring, yeah. Over familiarity maybe. James Raffin's been on. Kevin Callan's been on. Colin Skeeth's been on, Mark Kelch has been on, and Justine Kerr-Genvan has been on. So if you're interested in the exploits of any of those people, just look up the episodes. You're the right audience for that. So I just wanted to mention those as well. You can find all of those on my site. So that is the end. Thank you. So hopefully it gives you a little insight into some of the resources that you can find on some of your trips. There's lots of good stuff and interesting stuff out there once you start looking at, it isn't all about what's going on in the water. There's tons and tons of interesting stuff going on just on the banks. There are a few things you need to be mindful of, but most of the trees and the plants there have got some really beneficial uses, and the more you learn about those, the more you can incorporate them into your paddling exploits. And just your general interest in the outdoors, which was where we all enjoy being. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm happy to take questions. I'm also happy to go for a beer. So whichever you want to do. Thank you very much.